Welcome to the Iconized New Scholarship Podcast. My name is Diego Platz Pereira. I'm a member of the Iconized Committee on New Directions in Scholarship, a doctoral candidate at the Universities of Münster and São Paulo, and a research assistant at the University of Göttingen. Today on the podcast, we're joined by Assistant Professor Dr. Mauro Arturo Rivera Leon, a constitutional law scholar with a very rich international background. He holds a habilitation degree from the University of Silesia in Katowice in Poland, a PhD in law and a master's in parliamentary law from the Complutense University of Madrid, as well as a bachelor's degree from the University of Sonora in Mexico. He has been a visiting researcher at several prestigious institutions, such as the Max Planck Institute in Heidelberg, the Perelman Center in Brussels, and the University of Silesia in Katowice, where he's now an assistant professor. Mauro has authored 6 books and over 50 academic papers or book chapters, earning multiple awards, especially in Spain and Mexico, and his work has been cited in parliaments across Latin America. He has also served in senior roles at the Mexican Supreme Court and the Federal Electoral Court. So today our conversation will focus on his new book, Supermajorities in Constitutional Courts, published open access by Routledge in 2024. So dear Mauro, thank you very much for joining us and welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Diego. It's a pleasure being here.
Yeah, great. So let's start with the basics. Mauro, what are supermajorities in constitutional courts and why did you choose to write a whole book about it?
Yeah, thank you for the question. So if I had to explain what is exactly a supermajority requirement in constitutional adjudication, so I would like to broadly frame it, is basically a rule that requires a court, normally an apex or constitutional court, to achieve a qualified majority to undertake a positive decision in any direction normally. That is, it can be that a certain rule by institutional design requires a qualified majority to repeal legislation and declare it unconstitutional, or simply to take any decision within a judicial procedure, like, for example, to declare that a law is constitutional or to declare that the constitutional court lacks jurisdiction to hear in the case. So in general, the full book is about those requirements in contraposition to simple majorities in which ordinarily 50% plus one or otherwise framed, more judges in favor than against the proposal suffice to undertake a decision. And I wrote this book, actually there's 2 main reasons about it, the formal academic reason and the true reason. And the formal academic reason is that this full book derives from a research grant funded by EEA Norway grants, in which I came to Poland for a few years to work exactly under this topic, and I promise I'll write a book about it. So that's a quite easy formal explanation. But the true explanation is that a few years ago, I realized that many scholars constantly were declaring that their own local jurisdiction, be it, for example, Peru or Mexico or sometimes South Korea, was the only country in the world in which you require a supermajority vote to repeal legislation. And seeing it as a Mexican accustomed to supermajorities, because we have set requirement, I just found it fascinating that so many scholars in the world were not talking to each other about the requirements of their local jurisdiction. And once I began doing a small mapping of said rules, I realized that there were over 20 countries with exactly the same requirements, so which is roughly the same number of countries in the world that have federalist systems. So I just thought that there was a massive research gap there, just waiting for some comparative and empirical work, and I undertook the task.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you for doing it. And at a broad level, what will you say that are the key arguments or takeaways that you develop in your book?
Well, I would like to think that my book has 3 broad contributions. A very first broad contribution is that, as to the best of my knowledge, is the first time that there has been such an extensive mapping of the functioning of supermajorities in constitutional adjudication. Yes, sure, there are a few papers, I'll say four, maybe five, six papers, which focus on the functioning of supermajority rules in specific jurisdictions. Particularly, I'm talking about North Dakota and Ohio, and certainly a recent one about South Korea. But aside from that, there was not a single instance of systematized work in which someone really looked at the practice of how supermajority requirements operate in court. So I believe that one very first broad contribution that this book makes is that it offers a very broad mapping of how these rules are designed, how these rules work, what effects have they produced in several jurisdictions and several scenarios. Then contributions 2 and 3, I think, would be key takeaways about supermajorities. In the first place, one of the main arguments that the book makes is that supermajorities, contrary to how scholarship has treated them, they are not monolithic. We tend to assume that supermajorities are just these big requirements that can be just discussed abstractly. Venice Commission sets, for example, said that the supermajority requirements tend to paralyze courts or are not optimal for constitutional adjudication. And that is great, but which supermajorities? Supermajorities of 60%, of supermajorities of 95%? Supermajorities for repealing legislation or supermajorities to make any judicial substantial decision? Depending on the way that you configure supermajority rules, there are different institutional outcomes which are privileged. And I think that one of the key takeaways of the book is that institutional design matters at a certain extent into how the full legal system will work out. And not only the institutional design of the rules per se, but there are several other institutional frameworks, like, for example, the manner in which judges are appointed, the term of the judges, who can bring, for example, a challenge to court. All these aspects interact in one way or another with supermajority rules and certainly with informal institutions surrounding said supermajority rules. And I think that it was high time to distinguish them, to offer a categorization and to explore in a personalized way which institution, which concrete institutional design produce a given outcome. And finally, the last takeaway, which is perhaps the one that I'll say maybe I enjoy the most, is that up to this book, there has been a common argument in scholarship, normally absolutely unsustained by the empirical practice or empirical exploration, that supermajorities paralyze courts. Dozens of scholars have written it in one way or another, that heightening the requirement, establishing a qualified majority, renders courts which are unable to place checks on the elected branches. And the Venice Commission said it so very straightforwardly in a couple of opinions that it issued. So it is, of course, intuitively a logical assertion that if you raise the threshold, you would create obstacles for these courts, and courts will not be able to function normally. And I think that the book makes a very strong case that it is not so. It makes it a very strong case from a comparative perspective because it shows how several courts have functioned perfectly with supermajority requirements, placing analogous checks on the elected branches as courts with majority rule. And in the second place, it also employed an empirical approach by making or completing, depending on the jurisdiction, several data sets and then employing elements of linear regression on those newly created data sets for the project. And I think I managed to prove that there is a very strong evidence suggesting that most jurisdictions would just marginally be affected by those supermajority rules, hence simply eliminating a very small percentage of those court decisions, granting additional deference to the elected branches, and lowering the potential problems that it can create, the fact that counter-majoritarian institutions such as constitutional courts or apex courts performing constitutional adjudications can have on the legal system. So I will say that this is it.
Yes, great. These are really interesting insights that you have in the book and analysis that you also provide. And if we would focus on the second point that you brought up, how could you give us some more details on how do design choices on supermajorities affect the way courts position themselves in relation to legislation or executive power? I mean, deference is a big deal when you think about supermajorities, but there is a great variety that you've proved or showed of institutional possibilities when designing them. So, how do they affect like this dynamics?
That is actually a great question. I would say that while scholarship has monolithically treated supermajorities in constitutional adjudication, they are two big models that the book identifies, two big broad variations of how such court requirements have been established. The first one, which is the traditional requirement, is what I call deferential supermajorities. And deferential supermajorities are models in which you require a supermajority only to repeal a law, only to declare that a law is unconstitutional. For every other court outcome, then you simply require a simple majority. Hence, courts are only required to achieve disqualified voting when they are asserting that a law is unconstitutional. In this way, the institutional design of the rule supplements deference because the system is forced to grant a certain level of aggregate deference. And there are already some mechanisms known by constitutional scholarship on how to supplement deference. So, for example, the presumption of constitutionality is one such mechanism. But that is a psychological mechanism. It requires a judge to undertake a very complicated operation and to, in the first place, analyze whether a statute is unconstitutional, and in the second one, whether such unconstitutionality is clear and patent. And we know from many studies on psychology that it's very complicated to make this distinction. The attitudes of judges show too much. However, when you require a supermajority, such deference is shown aggregatively, and it's already supplemented in the system. That is the first system. The second system is what I call decisional supermajorities. Decisional supermajorities differ from deferential ones insofar as they require a qualified majority to, to make any decision. Any judicial outcome requires a qualified majority. So to declare a statute unconstitutional, you require a qualified majority. To assert that the court lacks jurisdiction, you require a qualified majority. And evidently also, if you want to say even that a law is constitutional, you also require, surprise, a qualified majority. And these models place an enormous, let's say, tension and weight on courts because all the time courts are playing with this heightened threshold. But in turn, they do not promote any concrete outcome, as it is the case on differential supermajorities, and they place a very high emphasis on consensus and authority building by the courts. There are other models, actually one of the earliest models in the world, which is the Ohio model, that are mixed models that can be designed in a different way. So for example, in Ohio, the supermajority was required only since the Ohio Supreme Court had appellate jurisdiction when the court of first instance had ruled that a statute is constitutional. When it was the opposite situation, it did not require a supermajority. It's a very complex system. It proved to be non-functional, partially due to the way that it was institutionally framed. So I would say that these two main systems are how they are built. There are many other features of institutional design which intervene. So for example, what happens when a judge is absent? Normally, in many jurisdictions, when a judge is absent and there is a qualified requirement, if a supermajority is required in terms of votes, his absence is computed as a vote against the proposal, so be it the unconstitutionality of legislation or whatever decision the court is making at that time. And for example, there's also the question of thresholds. That is, which percentage are you requiring and which form you're requiring. Already, there's very subtle elements on it. But I will say that the main two features of institutional design are whether we choose a differential or a decisional supermajority.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I've been asking myself, I mean, supermajorities, they require also a special form of a court of judges of getting together and yeah, and deciding. And so how would you say, also considering this varieties of supermajority institutional designs, how do supermajority rules affect the dynamics and deliberations among judges within a constitutional court?
That is an excellent question. Actually, in this regard, there are other scholars which have previously theorized about the potential effects of supermajority rules. So, for example, already in the early 2000s, there were very, very good papers by Professors Sugarman and Kaminker. More recently, even there is a colleague from Chile, Caviedes, which also has written about the potential effects of such supermajority rules. And normally, we all speak about deference, we'll speak about consensus and authority building. But the book also minorly explores, since it is not fully a book on the theory of supermajority rules, that is, it doesn't delve so much into the arguments sustaining it, but it does delve into the manner in which supermajority rules alter internal court dynamics. In which sense? Normally, when you establish a requirement of supermajority for repealing a law, there is a recalibration of the internal balance of court. So, for example, if we have a court formed by 10 individuals, then each of those judges would hold roughly 10% of the decisional power of the court. However, if suddenly the requirement is 70% to invalidate legislation, then already four judges may veto the decision. So actually, in that precise moment, recalibration of the power is granting four judges at least 50% of the decisional power of the court, insofar as they're able to prevent any affirmative decision by, say, court, any movement of the status quo. And this recalibration has been said to force judges into consensus, to be more consensus driven, to hold less to their positions, particularly when deliberations are expected. And of course, here every court has a different story to tell, because the more workload a court has, the tougher it's for judges to actually engage in these consensus-seeking practices and so forth. But internal dynamics of court are altered significantly, and especially also courts can be prone into attitudes attempting to reach similar decisions without facing the difficulties of the threshold. So courts have been known to engage in active interpretation of the statute, declaring its constitutionality, but then supplementing a different meaning of the statute as to be able to do the same or to achieve a similar judicial outcome, but surrounding the supermajority requirement and so forth. So I think that scholars of judicial politics should also be very interested in how the recalibration of decisional powers from a purely mathematical point of view makes judges behave in a slightly different way that they normally would in systems under majority rule.
Yes, interesting. And I think scholars of the field of political sciences might be interested also in another question, which is since you've been dealing with, or you dealt with really different jurisdictions. I mean, you've taken like jurisdictions in the US, Mexico, Peru, and Georgia, for example. How does the role of supermajority rules in judicial review varies depending on political context, say in authoritarian regimes or emerging democracies, more established democracies? What could you say about this?
That is a great question. I'm gonna be very honest. Before today, I had never considered exactly to write explicitly about this distinction. Obviously, it's a very important distinction, and I think that this would have been a very interesting point for the book to improve, to offer a new direction. The book does not make distinctions other scholars have. For example, there's certain part of the scholarship that they have posited that supermajority rules can be operative or functional, but mainly on highly democratic jurisdictions, while in other contexts they are less suitable. What the book does delve into is what is the possible usage of supermajority rules in context of illiberal backsliding, and particularly in how they can be employed as weapons. And this one, I am aware of their usage. I devoted some sections of the book to explaining episodes in which supermajority rules were employed to try to tame courts which were not responsive to the new regime or were not responsive to the party's politic, as it was the case in Poland or as it was the case in Georgia, to put two European countries in which even the Venice Commission issued opinions on. But they're not the only countries. You could have seen some of these examples in jurisdictions which were not studied in the book, that were not covered, such as, for example, Taiwan, and that was also the case in the Philippines. But that is a slightly different case from studying the impact of the regime. We could also we could also attempt to explain if you could use them in these settings as means to prevent further confrontation. Normally, emerging democracies, they have a very delicate balance between the judiciary and the elected branches, since they usually have strong executives or strong theories of sovereignty. Parliament attempts to be omnicomprehensive, or in general, the elected branches actually attempt to achieve this higher status. So any early confrontation between the branches normally tends up a bit badly for those judiciaries. There's numerous studies on strategies that judiciaries in emerging democracies should follow to slowly build up their authority without being wiped out or disappear by the elected branches, particularly when they're prone to confrontation. I still think that perhaps supermajority rules are not a bad solution on those contexts, since at least at the beginning, they can try to minimize these risks while still reserving for major cases in which the unconstitutionality is clear, the possibility of striking down status. And if you see, for example, the development of many Latin American countries, actually in some of them, those rules were introduced alongside with the constitutional adjudication itself or certain amendments to constitutional adjudication, such as was the case of Peru, as it was the case in Mexico, as it was the case in Chile, that granting strong powers to courts came with these safety mechanisms, we could say, to try to ensure that the conflict would not be so open, or that courts would be very cautious in employing those newly acquired powers.
Yes, great. And if we will take a look into more methodological questions, I mean, what methodological challenges did you face in your comparative research?
Yeah, I think there's three main methodological challenges. The first one was language. This was very important. When you go through the book and when you go through the methodology of the book, you'll see that, as is often the case in studies employing a comparative method, there is a very well-grounded reason why these jurisdictions concretely were chosen. However, there's always a second, in all cases, in all studies of comparative law, there's also a second real reason, the real methodology of why certain countries were employed. And one of them was language. While trying to produce a very proper, deep account of supermajority rules, I attempted to ensure that I would be able to tell a full comprehensive story of those jurisdictions. And for example, there were a couple of countries which were very interesting to me, but I simply did not dare to include them since I did not have the linguistic skills required to deepen this knowledge on this topic. And I will argue in second point why this is a specific case with supermajority rules, which does not occur with other broader topics. And so, for example, the case of Taiwan is fascinating. I think that Philippines perhaps could have been a great case study as well. And there are other countries which were really interesting to me, South Korea, for example. But most of the information was not in English or in any of the languages that it's accessible to me. In my case, I do speak with a working command Polish, English, Spanish, which Spanish is a blessing because it gives you access to many jurisdictions in Latin America. And I have some quite reasonable understanding of German at a reading level. I now speak it less than I used to, but I can still speak it. But definitely with reading, I feel quite comfortable in German. And I try to grab this set of methodological tools and pick jurisdictions which I could explain. So for example, all jurisdictions which have predominantly English-speaking materials were very easy, particularly the US. I could have also included India, since India previously had a supermajority requirement, but I assessed that it had not been such a significant experience in the terms of how it had worked. Also, for example, the Czech Republic and Czechoslovakia was particularly complicated. With the Czech Republic, I have many friends and colleagues from the Czech Republic, which really help, and I made several contacts within the Czech Constitutional Court. So I grabbed primary materials, primary contacts with some colleagues, which really helped out. And in the case of Czechoslovakia, I was very pleased to learn during my research that most of the materials were still in German, because at that time, after the fall of the Habsburg monarchy, most of the Czechoslovak elites were still writing in German, many materials. So Weyer, for example, was still writing in German mainly. So I had access to all of these materials, which was very rich. And German scholarship has also studied significantly Czechoslovakia, and I was able to paint a very accurate picture of it. And all the supermajorities in Spanish there were definitely easier. I know that there is a trend in comparative scholarship trying to explain why you actually do not need to learn languages to make comparative law. I think I do not fully endorse that. You can make comparative law to a certain extent, and you can rely on an extensive set of collaborators, friends, research assistants, as is often the case of many scholars on the global north. But the deepness that you can assert is not always the same as when you can actually review the materials, knowing what can serve to you. So that was a very first, very key challenge for me. When to cut, when to stop including jurisdictions, because it was a very ambitious sample, and which languages to attain. And the second one is the availability of materials. And I say this because even in Spanish or English, even in those jurisdictions which are very easily accessible from a linguistic point of view, materials pertaining the way that voting rules function are very scarce. Normally, we tend to see these voting rules as very subtle, very ingrained mechanisms which are not devoted any attention. It's hardly that you'll get any paper exactly on how those majority building processes, coalition building works in those languages, how really these internal procedures means. Then furthermore, many of these instances are cases in which all these buildings of coalitions, they occurred under closed door because most systems have closed deliberations. So you never know how they reached the decision, how they reached the majority. Was there a vote training or not? How they established set mechanisms. So it was particularly challenging. And I tried to remedy it by including many considerations on the informal institutions surrounding those voting mechanisms, that all these unwritten rules that surround the formal voting mechanisms. And I also interviewed several judges from the relevant jurisdictions, and they were kind enough as to tell me a couple of insiders, I wouldn't say secrets, but insiders tips onto how to understand their jurisdiction. And of course, without this information, I'm not even talking about an expert of that jurisdiction, but without the information provided by a judge which has worked under this requirement, I wouldn't have been able to uncover many of the secrets and ways that this jurisdiction function. And finally, the third big methodological challenge is that in the middle of the project, my daughter was born, and then there was a substantial cut on the available time to do research to write. So definitely this was a very challenging methodological issue which I had to face, that on top of it being a book written under a grant, I had to finish at a set deadline to finish and submit. And it was a bit of a challenge, I have to say.
Yeah, it might have been the biggest one, I believe you. But Mauro, you've also worked in both academia and the judiciary. So you have talked to judges and trying to understand these informal institutions, but you have also like this practical experience. And how would you say that your practical experience influenced your research and view in this book?
Thank you for the question. Yeah, I think that there is a very clear influence. I actually had two brief contacts with constitutional courts. In the first place, I was a fellow, constitutional doctrine fellow at the Spanish Constitutional Court, and I was there a year and a half in the constitutional doctrine department. So definitely I got a bit of an insight of how it works, particularly how law clerks draft rulings, how they try to attain the majorities, because law clerks have a very strong role in drafting resolutions in many jurisdictions. So that is a very important thing to know. And then I was around 5, 6 years working at various roles at the Mexican Supreme Court, which performs the function of a constitutional court. It is in practice a constitutional court. And I also work at another apex court, which was the electoral court in Mexico, Sala Superior, so-called. And definitely the fact that in many cases I drafted rulings which were voted under supermajority requirements, or I wrote many reports advising my justices. I work under two different justices on how to achieve set majority, or how to try to block achieving set majority, which arguments could drive the requiring judges necessary to blockade the decision. was a very big help to me. I had many intuitions of how these rules work simply because I always started by the supposition that it should work in a similar way as it works in Mexico. So I started always under this supposition, having seen how it works on my own jurisdiction, always gives you a bit of an insight of other courts because every court is different, but they also have a very massive big core of similarities from which you can draw. Obviously, in many cases, those intuitions will be wrong, and there is a very strong either institutional or informal component in another jurisdiction, which completely changes the dynamics. You need to learn it and live to fight another day. But in many cases, you're right. When you start making these questions and you remember that there was a situation in which this happened, and then you make the same question in a different jurisdiction, bingo, you get exactly the same answer. And I think that I heavily drew on that previous expertise, having seen from the inside of courts how they work, how this reassignment of decisional capabilities function, how the minority attempts to block it, or how, for example, strategically some judges sometimes change the manner in which they vote, how even there is open instances in which judges vote insincerely just because they feel that there is a strong principle supporting the position for the unconstitutionality, even if they don't agree with it. Or, for example, the tensions that occur when judges, they do not fully agree with the supermajority requirement on a policy level, but at the same time, in a specific instance, that rule is supporting their position, and there is this contradiction between what they want and what they procedurally actually would want. And I think it's fascinating. I drew up on this experience to try to particularly draft many questions for judges from different jurisdictions, and I was able to uncover many of such subtle details, as for example, in the cases of absences, since there will be a negative vote when there is a strict vote requirement. If you require 7 votes and suddenly one judge is sick and there's only 6 votes, you still require 7 votes, so you just are unable to achieve the majority already. One sick judge, for example, or 2, 3 sick judges, or judges which are on vacation, they're on leave, they already can drastically change the court judicial outcome. And based on the Mexican intuition, I had a very strong instinct that there were several informal mechanisms to avoid exactly that unfortunate outcome in which external circumstances decide on judicial outcomes. And it turned out that in many jurisdictions, it was the case. So I believe that this previous judicial experience, it really helped out a bit to approach this topic.
Yeah, great. And if you would sum up, how would you say, or in what ways do you think that your findings will inform reform efforts in countries considering introducing or revising a supermajority rule?
This one is a very challenging question because I've been talking a lot about elements of institutional design. And one of the main elements of institutional design is the threshold. Which percentage do you require from a court? So it's not the same to require 60% as to require 80, 85%. And one of the main things that the book disproves is the relationship between this element of institutional design and court paralysis. So actually, part of the book just disproves that sheer institutional design theories can explain the outcomes that will be rendered by supermajority rules. So I think that one of the main manners or key takeaways that policymakers could attempt to draw from this book when introducing similar rules to their jurisdiction is that you need to really look at the bigger picture and not only at the manner in which you design the supermajority rule, because the supermajority rule will heavily be influenced by all these collateral factors: the legal standing to access in courts, the manner in which judges are appointed, the term the judges or justices are vested with. So to fully predict the impact of supermajority rules, which is almost impossible, it's impossible to predict institutional effects, which are absolutely dependent on many factors, many of them depending from the behavior of humans. You would really need to take into account many other factors which are not directly related with the sole institutional design of those rules. So I think that would be number one key takeaway. And the second one is that it is possible to obtain the theoretical advantages of set rules, that is deference, consensus building, authority building, while avoiding their theoretical drawbacks, which they also have set drawbacks. Actually, one of the most challenging questions that I got was, what were my main arguments as a supporter of the superiority of supermajority rules over simple majority rules. And it was very challenging because I am actually not a scholar supporting the view that supermajorities are superior to simple majority rules. I believe there are an alternative set of institutional designs that can produce positive outcomes that can be in some cases better, in some cases worse, that simple majority rules, just as it's impossible to say if it's better to have centralized constitutional courts or if it's better to have Supreme Courts performing diffuse judicial review. It's a debate. It's impossible to solve it. And we have instances of jurisdictions which are very successful with the first model and very successful with the second one. And we have instances of jurisdictions which are a total disaster with both models because the answer depends on many contextual factors. So I think that will be my main key takeaway, that it's not only the design of supermajority rules, but it's also all the collateral framework, be it formal and informal, that will surround supermajority rules. Because in many cases, these rules are tamed, controlled, changed, and modified actually by informal factors, which normally policymakers cannot simply observe by reading statutes and constitutions.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. And what are you working on now? Like a final question right now, like what's next after supermajorities in constitutional courts?
Yeah, I'm sad to part away with this topic because I really lived this topic during 2, 3 years, and it really has some almost poetic connotations. There are certain episodes of supermajority rules which I really fell in love with when you read the debates of Ohio or Czechoslovakia. Really, not only the level of the debates, which was so enjoyable to read, but also the language in which they were drafted. I really felt that sometimes writing a novel or reading a novel in the manner that they spoke. So it's a bit sad to part with the topic. I'm currently working in one minor project or one minor branch of my research interest, and then I have my own academic big project. And the minor branch is that after supermajority rules, I began delving into informal institutions. So I've been expanding. I have several papers now on informal institutions, even on judicial informal institutions, alongside with a judge, a former judge from the Polish Constitutional Tribunal. We wrote a full paper currently pending review on informal institutions through a lead interview, which was very interesting, trying to delve into the approaches provided by judges themselves. And I have a couple of other open projects on it, a small monograph on supermajorities, on informal institutions in judicial decision making as well, which I am about to finish. And now I actually started since a few months another major research grant in Poland. I want a grant called Opus, and my project is called Constitutional Suksbank. And it is a project intending to measure and quantify the impact of hyperamendment procedures on constitutions. So basically, we have a research team. We have one postdoc and three PhD researchers besides the PI, and we're attempting to see which economic, political, and normative outcomes are associated to those jurisdictions in which you have phenomena of hyperamendments, and whether or not there is a lower or worse institutional performance associated with this attitude of repeatedly changing the constitution. So this project would give us some job and some preoccupation for the next 4 years, I believe. And we'll be trying to mix a bit qualitative methodology with primarily this project is quantitative oriented. So I think it'll be fascinating to be working with all these new fields.
Yeah, great. Then I wish you success for your new projects. And in general, thank you very much for your insightful comments on your book and for sharing all this with us.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure of being here. Muchas gracias.
Bye bye.